Okay, comment, you're on.
All right. Good afternoon and welcome to the keynote talk for the Plunder, Pillage and Spoils of War in History and Law Conference hosted by the Royal Armouries and supported by the Levitt Trust and the Histories and Cultures of Conflict Research Group from Manchester Metropolitan University. I'm Dr. Connor Wilson, a Levitt Early Career Fellow, and thank you for joining us today. I've got a few technical matters to go over. First of all, we will be taking questions both from ourselves, but also from the Zoom Q&A function, as well as the YouTube chat, and of course from yourselves. If you are hearing me online, send them in as they occur to you, and I'll put them to the speaker after the talk. We can't guarantee, sadly, to get through all of them, but we will attempt to cover the popular ones as best we can. Those who find them helpful can add subtitles using the CC button, which is marked, you'll be able to see on the screen now. I particularly also encourage you to send us feedback after the talk. You should be able to scan the QR code by pausing the intro slide, or access the link in chat in Zoom or YouTube. And if you've booked, and we'll send around the questionnaire after the event. We'd be very glad to hear what you have to say, whether you attend live or are watching us online. So please, I encourage you to do so either way. With all those technical matters out of the way, let me introduce today's speaker. Dr. Steve Tibble is a graduate of the University of Cambridge and University of London, and a former student of the late great Jonathan Riley Smith. Following the publication of an academic monograph, a study of political tension in 12th century Syria and the Levant, what we now often call Crusader states, Steve embarked on a successful career in communications for the finance industry. From corporate strategy development, he eventually returned to the study of the medieval world, specifically through to the Crusades, where we can perhaps trace a through line here in his focus on military strategy, as well as one of the most formidable of those medieval corporations, the military orders. These are topics on which he has, in only the last several years, produced a range of both popular and academic works in history, including the Crusader Strategy, Yale 2020, which was shortlisted for the Duke of Wellington's Military History Prize, Templars, the Knights Who Made Britain, published by Yale in 2023, along with contributions on warfare and strategy to both the Oxford Illustrated History of the Crusades and the Cambridge History of the Crusades, both of which are forthcoming later this year. His lecture today is drawn from yet another book, his 2024 Crusader Criminals, Knights Who Went Rogue in the Holy Land, which moves beyond a traditional picture of religiously motivated military campaigns to consider hitherto underappreciated factors that contributed to an environment of lawlessness and brutality, within which theft, banditry, and plunder played a significant role. Lastly, and on something of a personal note, Dr. Tibble has not only made a tremendous contribution to the academic and public understanding of the Crusades, but also to the work of other scholars. I first met Steve shortly after transferring my doctoral studies to the University of London, where I attended my first Crusade seminar at the Institute of Historical Research. He was the first person to come and introduce himself to me. He sat and asked about my research and enthusiastically shared his thoughts. I recall it putting me a lot more at ease in a new environment, and I know just how much Steve's enthusiasm, knowledge, and openness with his time and thoughts have benefited a number of postgraduate students and early career researchers. So without any further ado, it's with great pleasure to hand over to Dr. Steve Tibble. Thank you.
Wow. Oh, well, that's fabulous, Colin. That's very, very kind of you. Thank you all for coming as well and sparing your time for this. Now, let me just get set up here. So, I don't know about you. I mean, I had a really rubbish COVID. I had a rubbish lockdown, and I got COVID 6 times. You know, it was grim, and I'm not good in any way. And I was stuck in between house moves. So instead of being in a house with a garden, I was in a 1-bedroom flat, rented, London, no garden, nightmare. You know, I'm just waiting to get COVID. So this work that I'm going to talk about today is something that I'm very fond of, actually, because it saved my what's left of my sanity. And I'm always grateful to it. And I'm sure we've all got our own COVID books, either in the pipeline or finished, but this was my COVID book. And I invested more of myself in it than I would have done otherwise, partly because I didn't have anything else to do, so which is says something. So what I'm going to talk about today is what it says here: plunder, pillage, and the usual suspects. Now, the usual suspects we'll go on to in a minute. What I would describe as plunder, pillage, and criminality is very much the usual things. And when I started writing the book, it was going to be called Crusader Criminals, which it still is, but it was about the usual things. It was, a narrative. It goes, 1120 banditry, 1115 piracy, 1130, muggings. It just went through a kind of list of ghastly activities that the Crusaders got up to. And when I say Crusaders, it's not just the European Crusaders, it's everybody in the field of the Crusades at that time. So this is an equal opportunity crime fest. This is a huge underworld explosion in the whole region. But the way I was approaching it was fun, but it was quite self-indulgent, partly because I didn't need to save my sanity. So it was very story-driven and very narrative-driven. And when I reread it, I thought, yeah, this is a nice story, but I could do better than that. So I went back round on it and looked at it a different way, which I'll explain in a minute. So as well as talking about the usual things, I started talking about the usual suspects. But before we go on to the usual suspects, let me talk a little bit about the usual things, just to give you a taste of all the wonderful stories that there are out there, because the Crusades I think it's a wonderful period because I don't have to live in it. It's grim, it's unremittingly grim, and it's grim for 200 years. It's one of the few periods of history where there's no peace. So normally, you have a war. We've got a war in Ukraine that's grinding to an end. It will probably, there's a ceasefire now. Maybe in a few months it'll end, or whatever, and it will have gone on for 3 years or whatever it is. The Crusades never had a finite ending for 200 years. Nobody could end the wars. Nobody, for a multitude of different reasons, could do it. There was the occasional truce, and the truces might run for a few years, but there was never legally peace. So what happened was you had warfare for 200 years in an entire region. So the usual things happened. You look at the things that the soldiers get up to, and it's all ghastly. I've just picked. I could have chosen anything out of 200 examples. I'm looking at the Second Crusade here for a couple of minutes. Let's look at the German Crusaders. What did they get up to on the Second Crusade? Now, I have to stress, everything I'm talking about takes place in Christian territory. Okay, so this is just the lads behaving badly. They haven't got anywhere near Islamic territory yet. This is just guys on the march. So, 1147, there's a very charming incident took place, and it was just one of many such incidents. We know that the German army ended up in Philippopolis, which is in Byzantine territory, Eastern Christians, very close to the Catholic Church, who are obviously organizing the Crusades. And the German lads come into town and they start to relax, like soldiers do, like sailors in port. They go to the local pub, they go where all the drinks are, and here you find criminality breaking out straight away because of this febrile mixture of men who are desperate, tired, drunk in a foreign country. So it's this toxic blend of xenophobia, disinhibition, and just basically, bad armed people. And what happened was a juggler came in. We're not talking children's entertainer here. This juggler had a series of snakes. So this juggler, who was Christian, but he wasn't speaking German, he was speaking Greek, which they couldn't understand. The juggler pulled out a snake, did a little trick or two, said a few things which they didn't understand. And I think that's the key, that's the trigger. The guys got paranoid. You know what a drunk can be like in a pub? Are you looking at me? You're looking at me. And then it all kicks off. And that's exactly what happened. So this poor juggler was just trying to make a fairly honest evening's wage, found himself being beaten up by the Germans. Eventually, they killed them. They literally ripped them apart. And then they destroyed the pub, and then they destroyed the whole area, just looting and pillaging and so on. So this is the Christian army in a Christian town on the way to the Crusades. How great is that? And of course, the French chroniclers love this. So those Germans, you know what Germans are like. They're queering the pitch for us nice French people.
Yeah, you're welcome.
And yet, the French were there as well. The French obviously were moaning about those naughty Germans, because they were making it difficult. The Germans were in front, sort of pissing off all the natives, eating all the food, beating people up. And the French were dealing with the consequences of that. So the French, in fairness to them, tried to do the right thing. And King Louis published very severe rules, very severe codes of conduct, which he did write down. And everybody, every senior leader, every even junior leader was forced to swear an oath. And an oath in medieval times was a big deal. They believed that, if you swore an oath, your immortal soul was on the line. But, and here we've got the words of a chronicler, and I love these words actually, because you can just feel the frustration in the chronicler's mind when he's saying it. So the chronicler is Odo of Doy, wrote down originally all this code of conduct stuff. He was there at the time. And irritatingly, he doesn't write it down in his chronicle. And he just angrily says, because they did not observe them well, I have not preserved them either. So he's like, oh, they're all. And he was quite right. The French army was just as bad as the Germans. Don't listen. But they were. And everything went wrong. The criminality just broke out all over the place. And you can see there exactly that kind of thing. And ultimately, as a medieval commander, you're left with a very, very brutal choice. I mean, Louis did the right thing, which was harsh. Men were hung, men had their arms chopped off, and so on. But there comes a point where you just can't keep doing that. Your arm is not that big. And if the deterrent breaks down, you've only got X hundred knights. You can't hang them all. And given that they're so inclined to criminality, you just have to let the guys do it. So there was, again, as Odo said, the choice was either to kill many thousands at one time, at which point there's no point proceeding because you haven't got an army, or put up with their evil deeds. So eventually that's what happened. That is the level of criminality that we're talking about here. This is this plunder, the spoils of war in kind of the raw. And this is just a few weeks. I've just picked out a few weeks, and this is not on enemy territory. This is what the lads get up to when they're playing. They're not even playing the away match. This is just them on the way there. So I started writing the book, and it was fun, but it was a bit unremitting. It was a bit like that. It was story, killing, hanging, criminality, and so on. Great. So I thought, okay, how do I make this a little bit more interesting for me and a bit more interesting for the reader as well? Trying to put a proper way of looking on it that's an analytical look rather than a kind of narrative look. And again, because it was COVID and lockdown, I ended up watching a lot of the old films that I've never had time to watch in real life. And I watched the usual, wonderful Casablanca. And as you probably remember, there's a fabulous line towards the end where Captain Louis Renault is basically making a joke. He's telling his friend he can get away, and while he's getting away, he'll cover his tracks by I will round up the usual suspects, which is a great line, and it's a great line because it's funny, but it's also a great line because it's sort of true. It's the trope of lazy policing. That's what a lazy police force does. But then it occurred to me that once you understand that line, there are basically two parts to that very short sentence. One is rounding up, and the other is the usual suspects.
And those words to me explain a lot of why the Crusades were happening, but in particular, it explains why the Crusades were so associated with criminality. And they were just chock full of it. And that is that if you look at the Crusades from the point of view of anthropology rather than religion, a lot of it makes a lot more sense, particularly when you're looking at criminality. It's a very simple, it's almost it's like it's a lazy way of looking at crusading, is to just say, oh, well, it's about religion, it's about us and them, us and the other, this and that. It's a very binary and quite shallow, I think, in some ways, way of looking at it. But actually, what I wanted to do was to look at history from the top down, rather than just from a kind of narrative in a linear way. And once you do that, the thing that came up in my mind the whole time was that the issue wasn't religion, it was more anthropology and demographics. And the demographic, which we'll see, is the demographic of young men. They're the usual suspects. And time in the Crusades, when you see criminality, it is the usual suspects. It's young men, they're dislocated, they're disinhibited, they're 1,000 miles away from their family, they've got weapons training, they're surrounded by civilians who can't defend themselves. You just have this kernel of a demographic time bomb waiting to happen. And if you think of the Crusades as being wars with the usual suspects, a lot of the things begin to make a lot more sense. So I think as historians, we all look at events, and this is a good thing. It's nice to have evidence, and we all like to look at history books in that way. We look at, king is born, queen is born, somebody gets married, an invasion takes place, there are a few battles, king dies, a new one comes on. It's like Hello Magazine. You get this kind of Hello Magazine view of the world. And there's one person jokingly said once, history is one thing after another, and I love books like that, but I wanted this one to be different. So instead of looking at things one thing after another, I wanted to look at the macro events, because if we've got a whole load of the usual suspects here and a disproportionate amount of them, what are the big macro forces that have caused that? There's clearly something unusual going on here. And then below that, to look at the micro events. And particularly in medieval, I'm sure a lot of you know, when you look at a medieval chronicle, the people who write them are quite often heavily religious. They're often professionally religious, and they're easy to embarrass. They've got a bit of an agenda. They don't want the embarrassment of having cops and robbers going on at the same time. So they kind of airbrush out a lot of the bad boys doing things because it can be embarrassing for them. But in the Crusades, even with all that happening, there is a mass of anecdotes of really crazy criminal activity happening the whole time. So what I tried to do was to understand the macro events and see how they were creating this kind of micro history. And the key thing that comes out of it, when you look macro, is that there has been quite a lot of work done on the bigger issues, and the kind of big issues nowadays that we think are terribly modern and terribly new, and we've just invented them, were actually the things that were changing events then. So we'll talk about it in a minute, but there's a huge amount of evidence for climate change in the Eastern Mediterranean in the period leading up to the Crusades. That same climate change, we know, forced a lot of the uncontrolled migration from nomadic tribes, the Turkic tribes of the Western steppes into the region. And it was that uncontrolled migration that sparked off the Crusades, but not just from a Christian perspective. What you see here, you can put religious labels on it, but really what you're looking at is nomadic tribes fighting sedentary societies. And it actually makes a lot more sense if you almost take the religious labels out and just think of it as anthropology, nomads versus sedentary. It's like Magnificent Seven. You've got the bandits of the nomads, they're coming into town, the villagers are sedentary, they can't really defend themselves, they bring in other people to help. And that's kind of the metaphor for the Crusades, really. And the amount of stress that those changes impose creates a massive societal problem. So I think we all enter into the Crusades and you look at it and you think, oh my God, this is a war, it's battles, that causes big problems. And that's true, but probably almost a bigger problem is the longer term criminal effect. You know, that societies are destabilized, people can't leave their villages without going with, 10 mates to go with you. The fact that social cohesion breaks down is hugely important and very ignored. So let's have a quick look at crusades. Now if you're from one of the Abrahamic religions, you'll be very aware of all these sites, all these locations. And that's really one of the sad facts of the Holy Land, is that it is all bigger than life. It all seems so familiar. If you go to Jerusalem, you can't chuck a stone without hitting something that's got importance to at least 3 religions. Everything is so febrile because it's so rich. And this is the eye of the storm. When you read a book about the Crusades, this is the kind of environment they're in. This is where the battles are happening. This is, the crux of the matter. And for medieval people in Western Europe, certainly, Jerusalem was literally the navel of the earth. I mean, it was ground zero for the world. So this was concentrated. But now I'm colorblind, so this is going to be a magic thing for anybody who's not colorblind. You'll see, there's a little bubble appearing there. And actually, when you look at the criminals, so when I did a huge survey of criminality in the Crusader period, 200 years, the area in what I think is red, possibly green, is that. We think of it as being so big and so important. It's actually tiny. But the guys who are doing the action, the criminals are coming from all over this. This is Google Earth, I think Google Maps. But everybody is converging. It is actually like a kind of magnet for some of the world's most dangerous people. So take Ireland, top left-hand side. You've got Ireland there. There are guys from Ireland coming and joining the Crusades. Scandinavia at the top, you get Viking Crusaders, even Viking fleets coming down to help. If you look at the Turkic groups and later the Mongols, you've got people coming from the Chinese borders coming in. You've got sub-Saharan Africans, as well as the obvious areas of, Egypt, Syria, and so on. You've got sub-Saharan Africans being pulled into it by the Fatimids, who have huge kind of slave infantry armies, and so on. So it's actually a kind of a vortex. And what we've got here is not just a vortex of a few regular professional soldiers that are going to come in for a short war. What we've got here is a magnetic pull for young men who fit all the characteristics of the usual suspects for 200 years. And they just converge. It's like a convention for people with the highest potential for criminality on the planet. And once you realize that, you can see why the Crusades would be so violent, not just in terms of battles, but in terms of civil life. Just walking down the street is a contact sport in some parts of the Crusades. So what was this climate change? What's the big deal? I mean, surely climate doesn't change that much. And in fact, the Middle East, the Eastern Mediterranean, is normally fairly stable in terms of weather anyway. It's very lucky because it's got 2 quite separate weather systems. And obviously they're both subject to change, but it has 2 systems to operate on. So in the Eastern Mediterranean itself, you get the normal cyclone, counter-cyclone system going on. By and large, it works. But if it doesn't work, you've got a secondary system. So you look over towards Egypt, and I think this is green, being Google Maps again, or Google Earth. This is the Nile Delta, and the Nile Delta works off of an entirely separate weather system. So the Nile falls and rises according to the East African monsoons. So even if the East Mediterranean weather systems break down, usually, 99 times out of 100, you find that the Nile is fine, they're producing lots of food, and it's uncomfortable, but the region survives. it's a kind of a fail-safe. And I'm sure it's one of the reasons why this part of the world is one of the kind of origins of humanity, or origins of civilization, is because it does have these two weather systems. And when one's down, the other's up. So it's a kind of fail-safe. But, and here's the Crusades, that broke down. The later part of the 10th, 11th century, that system failed. And we know from the chronicles that in the Eastern Mediterranean, there's huge problems. You know, you get people dying in the streets of starvation, you get governments collapsing, and these are big shifts. And it's hard to prove quantitatively because chronicles are doing what chronicles do, they tell stories. But you can tell something ghastly is happening, and the frequency is unusual. We're very lucky that we also have something quantitative, though. It's not just a bunch of stories. On the Nile, there have been these things called Nilometers, and this is a picture of the inside of a Nilometer. And there have been Nilometers on the Nile for, since the Pharaonic times. Romans built some more. The Islamic states started to build more, and so on. But it does mean that we've got excellent records. We know when there was drought in the Nile Delta going way back. And we know from the period 300 to 900, so in the period running up to the Crusades, you could normally count on a drought twice a century, probably, which is not great. You know, people would suffer. But you could live the best part of your life and not experience one of those. And even if it did happen, the weather systems in the Eastern Mediterranean would probably compensate. Chances were that would happen. What we do know, sadly, is in the period running up to the actual launch of the Crusades, something shifted. And the Nile Delta just didn't behave the way it wanted to. It wasn't the normal system. And actually it goes into drought every 4 or 5 years. So you've got this horrible situation where you've got the Nile is failing at the same time as the counter-cyclones in the Eastern Mediterranean are failing at the same time. So, well, that all sounds a bit boring, that's kind of weather systems and so on. And being English, we like to talk about the weather, but it actually has a huge impact. And the big impact is migration. And it forces a whole load of Turkic tribes who are, then, because they're nomads, they've got very little flexibility. Their reserves, their society reserves are tiny. If their animals die, the animals can live for a couple of weeks, without a lot of food and water. But once the animals are dead, they are absolutely adrift. So they're forced to move where they can find more food. Incidentally, they can find more money, they can find more plunder and looting and so on. And I think it's worth noting that they're not just attacking Christians. They're attacking all the Arab states in the area. They're attacking the Egyptians, all of whom are Muslim, either Sunni or Shiite. And they're also attacking the Byzantine Empire, which happens to be Christian. But what we're seeing here really is the conflict of nomadic peoples who haven't got a choice against sedentary societies who also haven't got a choice. They've got no one has anywhere else to go, and they're being sucked into the same small part of the world. But who is in this demographic? Well, it is the usual suspects. And these are the guys that you see in the newspapers every day. We see them now. I think that might be Syria, or it might be a narco gang in South America. It could, under other circumstances, it could be in Africa, people called terrorists or whatever. It doesn't really matter what labels you put on them. It's the same demographic. It's these disrupted, alienated, volatile, testosterone-filled young men. And that's just as true in the Crusades. If you look at the Turkic tribes going down, if you look at who's doing the fighting, who's in charge of the criminality, time after time, it is that same demographic. And again, you look at the Crusaders, they're not old men by and large, and they're certainly not women. It is young men at the forefront of all the activity. And you find this still in crime statistics now, and prison, who do you think's in prison? It's in the UK, it's 97% men, 97%. So that means you're over 20 times more likely to be subjected to a serious crime by a man. not misogynistic or whatever the opposite is. It's just true. It's just a fact. And this whole influx was what caused a huge wave of criminality. So let me just say a few words about how some areas in which that criminality kind of exhibited itself. Start off with one of the most shocking examples. And again, I don't think religion comes into it at all. This is a little charming story about a lovely man called Zengi, the ruler of Mosul. And he was not brought up in a happy environment. His mother, or the woman he thought was his mother, no one was quite sure, was murdered by his father with a knife as a kind of joke. Well, he said it was a joke that went wrong. But that was the holiday season round at the Zengi household. It was utterly grim. So what kind of child grows into what kind of man? Well, we find out. So Zengi gets married to one of the girls from a local family for a political alliance. She displeases him while they're on honeymoon. And he actually prefers boys anyway. So he gets a whole load of boys who are his stable hands to gang rape her, so that she realizes that he's not entirely happy with their marriage. And that doesn't end well, goes in divorce, obviously. The other hobby he had was mutilating slaves. So he used to get young men, normally the children of his enemies, and he would castrate them or mutilate them in different ways, and then keep them as sex slaves, which is obviously ghastly. And one night, on the 14th of September, 1146, he had his coterie of young sex slaves with him in his tent. He's in the middle of a siege. And it's kind of crazy. You know, he's done all these things to these young men, but they're still in the room with him, you know, and he hasn't got many guards. But anyway, so this evening, they all get drunk. Zengi goes to sleep, and his young men are still around there. Zengi wakes up to find that one of the young men is drinking his favorite wine. Big mistake. So Zengi says, sorry, chum, when I wake up again in the morning, you're dead. I'm going to have you publicly crucified. So the young slave grabs a knife and beheads Zengi, literally just cuts his head off, absolutely ghastly. And everybody, you know, the guards rush in, there's yet more massacre. So in a sense, you might think, well, this is just an awful, awful story from the Crusades, but it can't be that unnormal, you know, it's the Crusades after all. But actually, if you analyze who was in that tent, it explains an awful lot. Literally, no one in that tent was an Arab. Every single person was a foreigner. The young slave, the mutilated kid who knifed Zengi was a Frank, so he was either French, German, or whatever. He was a prisoner who'd been subjected to all that. All the other guys in the tent were either Armenians or other Turks, or anyway, none of them were Arabs. Zengi himself, of course, is a big Arab hero now. He wasn't an Arab, he was Turkic. And every single one of them, apart from Zengi himself, were probably under the age of 20. So it is this classic febrile thing where you're just full of young, disorientated, potentially violent men. So we're not talking Jane Austen here. This is the Crusades. Just a couple of other examples of how criminality worked out in the Crusades. One of the questions for Crusades historians has always been, why didn't they have a fleet? You know, because you think the Crusades, they set up a series of colonies on the coast of Palestine or Israel and up into Lebanon, what we now call Lebanon, and beyond. They didn't have a fleet. They needed to control the sea lanes to get reinforcements from Europe, to get money and everything, but they never had a fleet. So how did they survive? And there's a wonderful example in 1115 that explains it all. So basically, there was only one big professional navy in the region, which was the Egyptian Navy. And they weren't brilliant, but they were the biggest and best because they were the only one. But if you look, we've got a very detailed analysis of one particular action. So the Egyptian Navy sails up the coast of Palestine. They're trying to reprovision some of their cities up there, but they behave really strangely. They've got a huge fleet, but they're panicking and they go in a convoy. And you know, you only go in a convoy if you've got something to worry about. So you think, well, what are they worried about? There's no Crusader navy. And it all became true. We find out what was happening because they got up to the north, they resupplied the town, Tyre, and then they came back. And then they panicked even more. So the convoy was so panic-stricken that it kind of split up. And when they sailed past Acre, which was a big Crusader port, you find out why they were so scared. Basically, every pub in Acre emptied. And the guys just ran down to the port and jumped on their ships. So there are always a huge number of merchant ships in the Crusades ferrying people, but actually they were all pirates as well. So you could be a merchant during lunchtime, but in the evening, if you saw an opportunity, you became a pirate. So we know that this huge Egyptian fleet was harried and attacked all the way back home, and the Crusader pirates just took hundreds of prisoners and took many Egyptian ships. So you then understand why the Crusaders didn't have a fleet. They didn't need to pay for one because they had a bunch of nutters who would do the job for them for free. The people were just out there hunting, pirate hunting the whole time. There's another fabulous aspect to criminality which I came across, which is very unusual, and that is the gangsters of Cairo. Very much like The Godfather, you know, where you get a bunch of immigrants coming in, they're put in a tiny ghetto, it's an era of prohibition, and these guys carve out a place for themselves in society by controlling these illicit substances. And that's exactly what happened here. A load of Crusader prisoners were stuck in Cairo because it was one big building site, so they had these guys as kind of muscle. And then over time, they just got, you know, looser and looser. They married the local Copt women. The prison system was not, you know, was pretty unregulated. The guys were allowed out every day to go to the building sites anyway. And you find within a couple of decades, these prisoners of war are running nearly all the kind of underworld. The criminal underworld of Cairo is run by these Crusader gangsters, and they're controlling prostitution, drugs, particularly alcohol, because in an Islamic society, they're not allowed to be seen to do that, but some of them are keen to become customers. So bizarrely, you find this thing where there are still references to Crusader porters and Crusader prisoners 100 years after the Crusades are finished. And you think, wow, this is a bit weird. You know, what was life expectancy in, you know, in the 13th and 14th centuries? Well, not that long. And the reason is that it became a hereditary occupation. So you have these hereditary gangsters who are basically they're Franco-Egyptians, they're half Coptic, half Catholic, but they're controlling all the local drugs and alcohol trade. I mean, the crazy stuff. And some of these guys would be monks, you know, some Templars or Hospitallers. So you get this bizarre, you know, Templars becoming godfathers, becoming, you know, sort of bandits in their own quarter. And it's also reflected in a lot of murder. And I think one thing that we haven't really talked about in the last couple of days is the effect of criminality on people's psyche. You know, just the pressure of living in a society that's kind of a bit of a pressure cooker, and the effect that can have on people. And just very briefly, one tiny story here. We have a wonderful incident where a Crusader diplomat just basically had a nervous breakdown. And again, he was in a part of the Byzantine Empire. He was a guy called Brother Robert, who was an assistant for a Crusader bishop called William of Acre, who was one of the leading diplomats. And the guy that, you know, the Crusaders tried to make him better. You know, they didn't abandon him. Bishop William, who was a really good guy by all accounts, made the kind of expedition stop, and they tried to wait for Robert to recover, but he was past recovery. And one afternoon, while they were resting, Brother Robert grabbed a sword and stabbed the bishop to death, which was shocking, obviously. But what I thought was really interesting and quite sort of pleasant, really, it was quite surprisingly good, was that Bishop William, before he died, had time to forgive Brother Robert. And came up with a very, very modern explanation about why Brother Robert shouldn't be punished. And that was because he said he had no choice. He had no control over his actions because he'd had a breakdown. It's what we would call diminished responsibility. And to me, it's one of the earliest instances of diminished responsibility that I've seen in a legal situation. So did Bishop William was died, but Brother Robert wasn't punished. He was sent to be a monk again. And that was what happened to him. Just finally, I'll end on a sort of kind of Jason Bourne kind of note here, a little bit of extreme violence, extreme ways. One of the things that this kind of febrile atmosphere of criminality and violence created was the need to have a standing army. And for part of that army in the Crusades, they were Hospitallers and Templars, this kind of weird hybrid of military soldiers plus monks. One of the most bizarre stories right at the end of the Crusade, well, after the Crusades had finished, really, with the Hospitallers, was in Rhodes. And in 1381, there was a very controversial murder. The head of the Spanish part of the order was murdered in Rhodes, and his body was found on a beach. That was a big, big scandal. The finger of suspicion was pointed at a very senior brother called Bertrand of Gagnac, but there wasn't enough proof. So dear Bertrand kind of got away with it. Bertrand was mad as a badger though. I mean, you'll see in a minute, he was super crazy, super litigious. So rather than let it rest, he brought a court case demanding reparations from the people he thought had been gossiping about him. And that came to nothing. A few weeks later, he then, because he was crazy, launched another court case saying that he deserved to be given a huge amount of money because he wanted to be put in charge of the whole commandery of Toulouse, which is one of the very, very richest preceptories of the order. But he'd overreached himself. And at this point, people started talking about what he'd actually done. You know, he'd had to get his CV together to try and get Toulouse. And when people looked at it, they thought, wow, you know, he's actually been stealing a lot of money. There are issues of dereliction of duty and so on. So effectively, he signed his own warrant by raising all these issues. All he had to do was just stay quiet, but couldn't control himself. So there was a third trial, which involved him being found guilty. So they all went to the chapel and he was about to be stripped of his robe. You know, so not a big punishment. He was just going to be thrown out and told, you know, take off your robe and go. You're no longer a hospitaller. So dear Bertrand, at this point, decided to show how innocent he was. Okay. So he reaches into his pocket and grabs a knife. Just so clearly he's mad as a badger, and he's been planning this the whole time. And he tries to murder the master of the entire hospitaller order, the Grand Master, who's an old guy. And they get into a kind of knife fight in the chapel. And then while that's going on, the other hospitallers all come in and they hack dear Bertrand to death. Okay, so it's like one mad thing after another, but this whole crucible is creating an atmosphere of violence and febrile sentiment that just makes it very difficult to break out of any of this. So I've only had time just to go through a few examples there. I mean, there's a million of them, but what I hope I've tried to do in some small way is to explain how we can have pillage, we can have spoils, we can have criminality and warfare. But above and below that, there are much bigger demographic, meteorological issues that affect society as a whole. So even when we see the micro stories, you know, they seem funny at a distance, they're horrific in real life, but at a distance, it looks like a, you know, James Bond movie. But in reality, it is dictated by forces way beyond the control of these guys. And I think as an individual, I'm just so glad that I write about it rather than live in it. So thank you so much for your time.
Yes, so we have a bit of time for questions, both in the room and online. Kind of, if you lead off, I'll keep an eye on.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, does anybody have any questions for us in the room? Yes, sure.
So, thank you. A quick point of comparison. When you look at medieval criminality in general, and some of the stuff on Avignon in the 14th century, you go from a city of 5,000 inhabitants to a city of maybe 40 to 60,000 inhabitants. When you look at how behavior of criminality, you fall in the exact same descriptions as well today. So it seems that climate change in Avignon, I don't know. I know there are some issues. It gets very cold. You can actually cross the Rhone. But I would say immigration, because Avignon is a city of immigrants, multilingual. And when you look at the criminality, it's people who don't understand each other. It's people who are packed against each other.
Yeah.
You know, you're making a fire, I'm smelling, I cannot sleep, it's hot, boom, I go in the street, I kill you.
Yeah.
So that it seems to be very human. So I could support, you can find a lot of
Thank you.
evidence making your point.
Yeah, thank you. I quite agree. I think my sort of meteorological stuff is the propellant for the Crusades, but in the case of Avignon, is the papal politics is the propellant for the inward migration.
Migration is one of the
And particularly of that singular demographic, which is young men away from home.
So I'll try and restate from the room, if that's right, for those who are joining us online, the questions, just because I think it might be difficult to hear. I suppose to just follow up on that, it seemed to be in essence a point that you touched on very early on about the dispute between the French and German crusaders on the Second Crusade, and maybe even in this sense of mass migration, this lack of familiarity almost breeds a sort of an unwillingness to give people the benefit of the doubt.
Yeah,
that is
right.
one of these significant factors. Would you say that that's the case?
Yeah, I think you can find that time and again. And it's paranoia. You can never underestimate paranoia. Can propel people in bad ways, particularly if they've had a drink. I mean, if you look at things like Jared Diamond, and his work on violence and civilization, I mean, there's really a very close relationship between the number of languages and the amount of violence. So say Papua New Guinea, where he did a lot of work, hugely violent because everybody's got a different language. Nobody understands each other. Very easy to become paranoid. And I think over time there's certainly a lot of truth in that.
Do we have any other questions from the room? Michael.
Thank you for your talk. I was wondering, when you were telling us about the Gangsters of New Cairo, what are the sources that tell us about the gangsters? Because they have to be Arab, right? So
So the question from the room was on the Gangsters of New Cairo, specifically about the sources that these are presumably Islamic Arab sources telling us about this. Is that the case?
Very largely, yeah. We're lucky we've got many different sources, more than you'd think, actually. It's putting them together creates a story. So you're absolutely right. People like Ibn al-Farad, and so on, we have quite detailed crime records for Cairo. I don't know why. I think they just thought it was quite fun. It's like a bit of a true crime podcast thing that we have today. But there's also archaeological stuff. We've still got some of the evidence for European French style architecture in some of the new buildings around Cairo at that time, because a lot of the workers were actually Crusader prisoners of war. And we also have European records because some of the guys got out and they came home, and so they feature in European chronicles, including Hospitallers coming back to England, 25 years after they left, and bringing people with them. It's a huge thing, and bizarrely, it goes on way beyond the Crusades. I think even into the 15th century, there are still references to the Frankish gangster quarter, 1415. I mean, clearly they're not actually Crusaders in any sense, but it is just almost like a folk memory at this point. And funnily enough, they never get wiped out. There's no political movement against them. What happens is they just get assimilated. They just disappear because, nobody's pretending they're Franks anymore. They're basically like, one of their great grandparents might have been a Crusader, but they've kind of lost it at that point. So it's a weird kind of Godfather story, it's a migrant community spreading out and really operating to their best advantage with their unique their USP is that they've got access to things like alcohol, which most of the other locals don't have, and they exploit that to the full, just like Al Capone and Prohibition. Thank you.
All right, we'll have one more question from the room, and then we'll have some questions from those who are watching online. All right.
Steve, thanks very much for the talk. That's
Pleasure.
really illuminating. Got a quick question about the Templars themselves, because the whole idea of the Templars, they're supposed to protect pilgrims on their way to, Jerusalem and the holy sites. But from what you're saying is that, well, they may have been part of the rabble that was coming with them. So did they actually officiate against some of the things that are going on, or were part of it? How did that come?
So for those online, the question was essentially about what is going on to potentially prevent this, and the questioner highlighted the role of military orders, as you said, a disciplined force,
Yes.
who seemingly were on the wrong side in some instances of these conflicts. But did they actually have any role in preventing this sort of criminality or plundering of the land?
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. And I think you have to preface all this with just a basic health warning about the nature of humanity. You take any organization with more than one person in it, and you're going to find a bad apple eventually. So the Templars, their original role, well, you're absolutely right, was to protect pilgrims. Effectively, they were a police force when they first started off. Then they became more important, and they basically became the standing army, or a large part of the standing army. And at that point, you're into large numbers. So the Templar brothers would only be 5 or 10% of any force. And then, so maybe 95% will be lay guys doing whatever they're doing. So you can imagine you're talking hundreds, and over time, you're talking thousands of people who are thousands of miles away from home, trained in arms, you're going to find people doing bad things. And you find examples of Templars becoming murderers, doing fraud, just all the bad things you'd expect. But it doesn't mean that that's what they're aiming to do. It just means that, that you get a few bad apples that let down the side, that kind of thing, which is true of the Crusades as a whole, I think, really.
So this is from Sable Eagle on YouTube. I might rephrase it slightly just to alter the question, but what are the contemporary phenomena that you see that remind you most of these circumstances around the Crusades? And should we be worried we're going to see more of them over the next decade or two?
That's a very good question. I see a lot of resonance with our modern situation. And one thing that I admire about the Crusaders, but also their opponents, is that they didn't have much in the way of resources. They didn't have Google Maps. They couldn't see the enormity of the problem. They didn't know that climate change was happening. They had no idea about the bigger picture, but they were very, very resourceful. And, they did the best they could under the circumstances. Whereas, I used to work in PR, so I can smell a PR trick when I see one, and you look at half of our politicians, maybe more than half, and they talk about strategy, and it's just talk, it's just a PR trick. Whereas the Crusaders and their enemies didn't talk about strategy because they didn't have that vocabulary, but you can see through their actions, they are very thoughtful, strategically minded people. Whereas our politicians have tiny, short, attention span. They throw words like strategy around, climate change, and actually, I think they just use it in a very cynical way. So slightly depressing view of it. But
well, although to a certain extent, it's our fault for electing them. So yes.
yeah. Who votes? Yeah, for them.
Yes, but no more on YouTube at the moment. So if there's any more in the room, then
essentially another clumsy parallel to nowadays. In the war in Ukraine, Russia emptied out prisons and sent prisoners into the conflict. Is there any evidence of Crusader countries doing similar things and trying to get rid of criminals instead of them?
So the question is, did the Crusader states, the Latin Christian states, did they empty out their prisons or seek out sort of collections of criminals elsewhere in an attempt to employ them against their enemies?
Yeah, that's an amazingly good question. And I've got a whole chapter on that. It's so true. And it's not just the Crusaders. It's, basically in Cairo, you find there are these, the reason that the prisons in Cairo are empty to put Crusader POWs is because they've emptied out all the prisons, and then say, taking England as an example, I wrote a book about the Templars in Britain. And you can just see whenever anybody goes into revolt or commits a murder or whatever, they're kind of told, you know, you can either rot in a dungeon in Gloucester for the rest of your short life, or you can go and get remission of sins and go and do good work in the Holy Land. And everybody says yes, because why wouldn't you really? And it's a better option. And you find it is exactly what dear Putin has been doing. And equally, you can see, just looking at the Ukrainian example again, you know, he's pulled in every warm body that he can. We've got the last offensive, as far as I can see, was primarily manned by Koreans, North Koreans, who were just, you know, pushed in a wave towards the Ukrainian troops in around Kursk and all that. So yeah, there's a lot of parallels. It's basically, you know, human beings are pretty awful, and there's only a certain number of awful things you can do, and they just kind of keep it on a roll. Yeah, sad, but true.
Are there any more questions from the room? Oh, got to. I think you were first.
Thank you, Crystal. I'm curious, I suppose, not knowing about the crystals and this theory that it's young men. Is there a passion of changing behavior then as they get older over time? Do you have a bigger, responsible, weary father, commander?
So the question was, given the youthful demographic of so many of these figures, it was highlighted Crusaders, are there any senior Crusaders who perhaps are acting in a way to restrain some of this criminality?
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, well, yeah, and there's another aspect really, which is, I'm not a psychiatrist, but you know, what is it that makes young men much more violent than older men? You know, is it just more testosterone or whatever it might be? But you're absolutely right that you do find commanders who tend to be older are trying to restrain their men who tend to be younger. And, you know, so for instance, we looked at the Second Crusade. Louis, bless him, is doing the right kind of things. He's got very strict rules. He's enforced kind of oath swearing. He's enforced severe punishments. None of it works. You know, it's no deterrent. When the guys are on the loose, they're just doing bad things. And it's so difficult to stop them. And it's not just a Crusader problem. It's you know, the Crusades, or that part of the world is a magnet, and you get the world's dangerous people converging on the same place at the same time for 200 years. And they do tend to, you know, the more dangerous ones do tend to be younger. Like that room, Zengi in that room was, I think he was 54, but there were probably 20 other people there. And as far as I can tell, no one under the age of 20 or over the age of 20, certainly 25. It's a very specific demographic. And that's reflected even in the prison populations today. It does tend to be overwhelmingly men and overwhelmingly younger men. Sadly, yeah.
Do we have anything else?
No, nothing more from YouTube.
All right, I think we had another hand in the other.
Yeah, thank you very much. You just already talked about the demography, and you focused on the Holy Land as the eye of the storm, or we heard about Avignon.
Yeah.
But it's not the only melting pot during the Middle Ages where different people come together. Maybe not as many young men, I guess, but would you say that, for example, in the Iberian Peninsula or in Sicily, the forms of crime were the same, or was it worse in the Holy Land?
Yeah.
If so, why?
So the question was as to other areas of the medieval world, and especially the medieval Mediterranean, where there are these same elements or demographic elements that you highlight. I suppose then the question is, and I'm very pleased to have this asked really, is there anything actually special about the Crusades?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I have to say, I'm not an expert in every part of the Mediterranean and every part of the Middle Ages. I've studied one area, but you raise a very good point. And I think, say, for instance, in Sicily, to a lesser extent, you do find these waves of guys coming in, of outsiders, tend to be young, tend to be quite violent and imposing their will. So there's certainly parallels in most societies. I think the difference with the Crusades is one, that it's the eye of a huge storm. You know, so many cultures, even if you forget all the religions, so many different cultures and ways of life have a stake in that tiny area, that it's just a magnet. And the other big thing about the Crusades is it's remorseless. It goes on for 200 years. You know, there's no ending to this meat grinder. You know, it's like the First World War times 20. So I think it is especially bad But I think you're absolutely right that those same circumstances do relate to other parts at other times. And I'm sure there are very, very similar outcomes as well. Thank you. Good. That was a good question.
I'm conscious of time, but I'm going to make use of my chair's privilege here to ask one final question, if that's right. You've positioned your thinking very much as says against perhaps traditional understandings of the crusading movement that emphasize religious conflict.
Yes.
Given that, would you then say that religious forces may have been one of the elements that actually restrained or de-escalated some of these situations? And I'll ask if you could speak perhaps specifically to phenomenon around looting spoils as opposed to maybe other sorts of violence that you find.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I think that the key distinction is between the ultimate causes as opposed to the proximate causes. So again, you know, following dear Jared Diamond, you know, he's looking at the big ultimate causes for things. And I think it is totally possible to talk about the ultimate causes of the crusade without mentioning religion at all. You don't need it. You can explain it with weather, anthropology, lifestyle through nomadism or sedentary behaviors. So you don't need religion at all. I think once you start looking at the proximate causes, you know, so what is it that brought people from France into the Holy Land at a certain time? What is it that brought the Fatimids to pull sub-Saharan Africans into their armies, for as long as they could? Those kind of things can be based on religion, and religion then does what it does, which is kind of variable depending on what the religion is and how seriously people take it. And I think you do find that there are some people who are religious, and that acts to ameliorate things. So, for instance, Saladin, love him or loathe him, he did have, he was quite pious and devout, and you find that when he's attacking other Muslims, which is actually what he spends most of his time doing, which people forget, that those wars tend to be less bloodthirsty, and he's trying to restrain people. And you find the same on the Christian side as well. It's, in theory at least, it's a religion based on love and non-violence. So as our friend was talking about there in terms of the Templars, their role was originally as a police force to stop violence. And the whole idea of Templars fighting was predicated by the fact that they were only allowed to fight to restrain people who were attacking Christendom. So it was very much seen as it was only justified as a defensive war. So I think, religion did play a part in ameliorating it at the edges, but only in an approximate sense. And I think it's really a small force that couldn't stop the tsunami of violence because of the ultimate factors being so much more predominating.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much, Steve. First of all, if people want to find out more about what you're doing, where should they be looking?
You could look at Amazon, for instance, or Yale bookshops and everything. Or I've got a website. I've got a silly name. Steve Tibble is a silly name. So the website is just stevetibble.com. So surprisingly, there aren't millions of them. It's just me. So you can see what I'm up to on that, or I'm on lots of different social media. If you want to pursue more of this, I did have a chapter on murder in the Crusader criminals book, and the assassins, the Ismaili Nizaris, played a big role in that. But eventually I took it out because it was clear they weren't criminals. They were political agents rather than killers. So I've written a new book for Yale, which is coming out in September, called Assassins and Templars, and how these two slightly crazy organizations worked. Even though they hated each other, they had this kind of strange conjoined relationship, and how their strategies kind of mirrored each other. And even today, their legends mirror each other as well, as we see in video games or any number of Templar conspiracies on the internet. So if you want to pursue the next volume, it's actually quite a fun one, and should be out September 9th, I think.
Wonderful. Right, in that case, a few final thanks. One to Mark, who is off camera. Another to Josh, who is behind the scenes for managing the feed and YouTube. But most of all, thank you to the audience for attending, for your questions and comments. We would love to know how you felt about this event, either yourselves in the room with us or those in the ether. And there are links to the surveys on the closing slides and in the chat. Thank you again, everyone. I hope you'll all join me in thanking Steve once again.
Thank you.
Absolutely, yes.
He will be so.